My name is T. James Reagan, and this is the T. James Reagan podcast. This is supposed to be weekly, not monthly, almost pretty much yearly at this point. It's a yearly podcast. If I make 2 of these a year, then I can basically be off until 2017. Why it's so infrequent is that I only do these after Vice rejects one of the pieces I write, where generally I write about, I'd say 5,000 words. I send it on over to Vice. I get no response every single time. And then I record a podcast where I read the piece. That's how this became the Vice rejection saga. Originally it started after a piece I wrote on post-Empire film and Bret Easton Ellis's The Canyons. I'll put a link in the description box of wherever you're listening to this, unless you're my next door neighbor and you're listening to it through the wall. Then you can just come next door later, knock on my door and say, hey, email me that link. I'll be glad to do it. We've never spoken before. It'll be a good icebreaker. I don't know who you are, but I'd like to get into your podcast. So let's do this now. The second podcast I recorded was a piece on Shia LaBeouf. It was back when they were going through that Howard Cantor, or whatever that short film was called, where basically everyone was telling me that Shia LaBeouf was, taking down the culture, blah, 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 respect writers, blah, blah, blahs, where most of the quote-unquote writers who had a problem with Shia considered their work to be writing, when it was essentially just like what I'm about to read to you right now is what they did exclusively for their writing. Like the thing that I'm just like throwing out as a fuck off, that was like their pride and joy. Like they gathered the children around to be like, listen to this thought piece I wrote about 50 Shades of Grey. Like that's their existence, and they were mad at Shia LaBeouf. So that was the second one I did. I think I've done a third one, but I don't recall what it was, so Vice was probably proper in denying that one. And then now here's my current one. This current one I wrote right at the end of Hannibal Season 2. It's about Bryan Fuller's Hannibal. If you haven't watched Bryan Fuller's Hannibal, then you're robbing yourself of the best television experience aside from True Detective. Not in my opinion. That is a fact. If you Googled what is the best television experience besides True Detective, this is what it would come up with, or the Lindsay Lohan reality show, but I think that thing got canceled, so here we are, left with Hannibal. Maybe there's a crossover episode in there somewhere. One could hope. Not one that Lindsay would be, fed to someone prepared in a kitchen or whatever. She'd just, be helping Hannibal. That'd be great, like Scully from the X-Files, Hannibal, and Lindsay Lohan. That's like fucking the Avengers of real life. Just great people, great humans assembled together. Alright, I get very poor feedback on the intro of this. This is like, I could probably do 5 minutes of ads before these podcasts and get better feedback than whatever the fuck it is I'm attempting here right now. So, without further delay, I bring you the latest in the Vice rejection saga. Title of this piece is The Teacup Gathers Itself Up by T. James Reagan. I like the Hannibal homage at the end she sent to me. I held my phone in my hands and I mentally paged through my second novel. She liked the Hannibal homage. Searching through my memory, I located only a single scene from Ridley Scott's film Hannibal, in which Ray Liotta is, forced to eat his own brain. I mean, he must have been forced. No one's brain is like, hey, I wonder what I taste like. I assumed she must have meant the TV show Hannibal. At the time, all I knew about NBC's Hannibal is that it starred the guy from Bride Wars. Any veteran of those terrifying and inhumane Bride Wars could clearly step into a show about a genius serial killer without a problem. Hannibal? I texted back. The TV show, she responded. So, what else did you like about my novel? I redirected the subject of our text because I had never seen the TV show Hannibal, so I was a little confused about how I was crafting homages to it. Empire Waste, my novel that allegedly was inspired by something I had never watched, was my 15th manuscript, but only my second to be released in paperback. I wrote the novel in a 3-month period of complete isolation. The loss of 2 friends, coupled with the confusion and regret associated with the disillusion of those friendships, colored the novel, and transformed my work into something that veered uncontrollably close to a diary, mixed with an apology letter. The dedication, where I stated simply, sincerely, "I'm sorry," was always part of the novel. It wasn't added after the fact, after I realized what I had created. The autobiographical elements, combined with the fact I remained on the furthest edge of the lit scene, without any notoriety whatsoever, shaped the story of Andrew Laurie. In Empire Waste, Andrew Laurie was presented as a disgraced fashion designer who found himself so desperate to continue his passion that he signed on with a rival fashion house in an effort to begin to rebuild his life. If the book was going to capture the precise feelings I had while writing it, the isolation, the regret, the nostalgia, for the entire length of the time I was editing it, I had to remain estranged from the people who inspired the characters I had created. I'd shattered 2 friendships, and the girls that hurt me, were the female leads in Empire Waste. I needed both friendships to stay broken until I had the novel on my bookshelf. The oldest of the wounds was the friendship I destroyed back in 2011 while writing what's now considered a prequel to Empire Waste. This girl was cut out of my life simply because the narrative of my novel didn't work when I was happy, and she made me happy. I needed an ending for the book, and I knew that sending this friendship into turmoil would provide me with the fuel I required to give the novel the conclusion it demanded. I did what had to be done, and I made sure my friend would want nothing to do with me. And I was right. It worked. This bizarre manipulation eventually had become a tool that I used to create and complete many of my manuscripts that I felt had stalled, or felt stale, or were derivative of something I had seen someone else do better. I explored the details of this technique in an indirect way in Empire Waste, and when I was editing the book, I began to feel a bizarre guilt about how things were framed in the final fourth of the novel. Due to this unease, I made sure that the story ended with a sentence hinting that Andrew Laurie, the narrator of the novel, may not be the confused, pawn-like creature he paints himself to be. The final sentence of the novel reads, "None of this would have been possible without the people I grew to trust and depend on, but make no mistake, all of this was by my own design." The sentence announced itself as the end of Empire Waste because, as I read the manuscript, slicing edits along the way, I began to feel I was whitewashing all of the things I should feel guilty for. In Empire Waste, I created a reoccurring situation where hopeful models would show up for go-sees, then they'd never be seen again. Andrew Laurie becomes obsessed with finding out what's happening to these girls. The go-sees are captured on video and screeners that are sent to Andrew's phone for his review. The primary influence for the screener concept was a banned 1995 Calvin Klein campaign headed by Steven Meisel. In the ad, young models in various states of undress were interviewed by an unseen stranger in what appears to be a wood-paneled basement. The idea that not a book, not a film, not a song, but instead a piece of commercial advertising could cause this type of controversy was exciting to me as a young man. The outrage and outright disdain that the adults around me surged with when discussing this commercial inspired me. I wanted to make people feel the same way, and this need grabbed me, even at a young age. Finding and watching this banned commercial in the pre-internet era was akin to getting my hands on a snuff film. I fused all of the things I had felt watching that ad. The excitement, the disgust, the curiosity, the lust. And I used it to paint the screener sections of Empire Waste. The only way to replicate this defining moment was to have models in a similar situation. Then push things further. In order to receive the reaction I wanted, I had to continue the commercial to its assumed end. I tasked myself with bringing to life all those moments that danced in our parents' heads when they organized their Calvin Klein boycott. The girls have to lose their lives, the motivator whispered into my skull. The motivator rationalized that I was providing a commentary on the abusive situations and various dangers girls in the industry are currently facing. The motivator wanted me to ignore the fact that the novel, at its core, was about a failed artist and a failed man. No one had to die, but the writer and the motivator demanded they did. After the second novel came out, I finally had the free time to catch up on all things pop culture that I'd deprived myself from while I was exercising Empire Waste from the forefront of my mind. After being enthralled by HBO's True Detective, I began searching for something that provided the same tight, careful, and nuanced experience. I figured that based on the unseen influence or parallel thinking I had with Bryan Fuller's Hannibal, I would give the show a chance. I was able to convince a friend at work to torrent the first season for me. Then I sat down to watch the show, aware of the fact that I was connected to it, yet also filled with trepidation because NBC executives had a say in the show. I was sure that it would be worse than even the most treacherous part of the Lecter franchise, Hannibal Rising. I watched carefully as NBC's Hannibal opened with Will Graham, an FBI profiler, walking into the aftermath of a deadly home invasion. Will arrives after the proverbial cup of tea has fallen off the table, and with a few quick mental swipes, he puts the cup back together, then goes about knocking it over again. For a moment, the victims are reborn, only to meet the same fate. Shot running down the stairs, catching a bullet while dashing to the security system. While Will steps through each action carried out by the killer that he's searching for, he announces, "This is my design," after firing the weapon, retaking the life. What most certainly would become a character tag, a trademark of the show, was also paraphrased in the final words of my second novel. Initially, I felt as though I had to change the final sentence of Empire Waste. I continued watching the Hannibal pilot, giving myself some time to figure out what the new conclusion of my novel would be. As the episode progressed, Will provided the information he gathered to the head of the FBI Behavioral Science Unit, played by Lawrence Fishburne. This man's name was Jack Crawford, and Jack and Will soon find themselves at the scene of another crime, this time set in a field where a girl is impaled on a set of antlers. I'd been searching for a replacement for True Detective, and this scene managed to mirror True Detective's opening. The deviation between the two scenes is that the girl in True Detective is wearing the antlers, while the girl in Hannibal is being worn by the antlers. This similarity allowed me to keep the final line of my novel. The growing number of unintentional overlaps also forced me to study the idea that Hannibal, True Detective, and Empire Waste all had this similar DNA because they were all written by males about the exploitation of innocent girls at the hands of man. Each story was vastly different, but the similarities bound them together in a way that I found myself tangled in for a significant amount of time. I immediately followed the pilot by watching the second episode, and this is when I changed my perspective on Hannibal. What once had felt like something different had somehow shifted to become an NBC-approved episodic garbage machine, the type of show I avoid at all costs. In the second episode, Will and Jack come upon a field of human mushrooms, set up with IV bags so they can continue to exist as living monuments of essentially nothing more than an, creepy, cheese plate moment. I took a bit of a break from the show at that point, but it was Mads Mikkelsen's performance in the outstanding Shia LaBeouf vehicle, Charlie Countryman, as well as Mads' complicated and careful acting in the foreign film, The Hunt, that made me desperate for anything that featured Mads. So I returned to Hannibal, and refreshingly, I found that the second episode was a rare misstep in the series, one of those inconveniences about putting out episodic TV which can't be edited like a novel can. With everything I've written, the last 10 chapters always change the first 10. As I continued to watch Hannibal, I found that the show wasn't about the murders. It was about why people are committing them. The lesser killers in the show, the monsters of the week, aren't focused on. They aren't explored. They aren't hunted for any significant amount of time. They're found merely for plot resolution, then the impact of their actions is discussed. Never does Will Graham go to the library and pore through records. I mean, does this guy even own an iPhone? Sliding deeper into Hannibal's first season, I found the teleplays asking the same questions that every creative person asked themselves when they wade into the muddy water of creating content about taking lives. If you look at Hannibal as a show asking the question, why do people hurt other people, the reasons to view Will as a writer are too far in number to be avoided. Bryan Fuller, writer and showrunner for Hannibal, previously worked on Dead Like Me, a show about quirky Grim Reapers, and Pushing Daisies, a show about a girl who can bring people back to life. Death is everywhere in Fuller's body of work, and in this current series, I can hear him asking himself why that is. What impact does it have? If Bryan Fuller is creating this as a writer, and he's writing this series as I view it, then he is Will Graham. Within the construct of the Hannibal universe, Fuller has given life to all of the characters a fiction writer is joined by when he makes the decision to kill on paper. Fuller, in my manipulative speculation, creates his incredibly accurate portrait of the artist as the enviable assassin with the following characters. The writer, Will Graham. The motivator, Jack Crawford. The created monster, Hannibal Lecter. The real-life monster, Matthew Brown. The writer appears as Will Graham, just as I had the endgame scenario of my novel, then worked in reverse to get there. Will takes these broken teacups, and with his golden swipes, he puts them back together. If Will does have an iPhone, it could be assumed that one of the tracks on there could be Leonard Cohen's Anthem. On the track, he proclaims, "There's a crack in everything. That is how the light gets in." As the writer, you're given a situation. An unstable FBI profiler must catch the very same man who is guiding his mental care. Then the cracks are filled in, and it's your choice what you fill them with. Will Graham arrives at a scene, then a golden thread wipes away the damage. This is the writer's version of kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with golden seams. This concept speaks to the journey of an object that a single break didn't destroy with permanency. Fuller's Hannibal states clearly, cracks are not weaknesses. A life lived accrues in the cracks. In some people's eyes, the gold lines in an item could enhance the object's beauty, causing it to transcend its assembly line carbon copy existence. In the first episode of Hannibal, Dr. Lecter remarks to Will Graham that Jack Crawford views him as a fragile little teacup, the finest set of china used only for special guests. Jack takes care of Will in some ways, and ignores his care in others. The fragile little teacup remains on the edge of the counter for much of the first season. Jack, first and foremost, protects Will's process. He makes sure that Graham is left alone when he becomes the criminal and performs a ballet of sorts that mimics what might happen when the crime is being committed. Will Graham acts in the same way I did writing most of my novels, most notably the prequel to Empire Waste titled We Were All in Love, where I attempted to write the great American lesbire, yes, lesbian vampire, novel. I also used this technique in my third novel, Leeds House, a typical cabin-in-the-woods style story, where there could only be one survivor based on the message I wanted to leave the reader with. Will, as the writer, works and lives in isolation. Just as the killer works alone, only revealing his masterpiece when it's ready, or until someone goes snooping and finds it, Will demands privacy as well. Will lives the writer's life. No family, few friends, no wife, no girlfriend, no boyfriend. Will's hobbies, fixing motors, creating lures, they're things that are done alone. Will is a teacher, almost as a distraction. He can use his abilities in his job, but not to their greatest power. It's steady. It's a paycheck. It doesn't require will to challenge himself. He can talk about other people's work without having any of it become personal, without having to get too wrapped up in the collateral damage. This provides Will with his much-needed distance. He doesn't interact with people. He can just review the facts, pose the questions, then dismiss class early. After all this, he can sit alone at his desk. The few times that Will does attempt intimate contact in his life, it's closely related to his talent. Margot Verger, a girl tormented by her psychopath brother, becomes the one woman throughout the 2 seasons to share more than a kiss with Will. These 2 characters are brought together by sharing the common thread of Hannibal's interest. Both Margot and Will are aware of Hannibal's questionable practices in a way that the other patients of Dr. Lecter simply are not. Margot Verger is a lesbian, but she sleeps with Will Graham so she can conceive a child, an heir to the fortune that Margot's brother, Mason, is using as bait to keep Margot around. I recognize that this entire relationship is how the writer meets women. The created monster brings them together, then the girl seeks the power of the writer, the keen observation, in hopes that it can solve some sort of problem. Margot chose Will Graham because he has an ability to think like a psychopath, and any Verger child would need this skill to survive the family. Will Graham's ability is a blessing and a curse. Will's solitary, I'll work it out myself mentality, when it comes to treating his abnormalities, hurts him. His Hulk-like response to Hannibal, "Don't psychoanalyze me, you won't like me when I'm psychoanalyzed," shows a traditional fear the writer has, that any review, any deep analyzing, could risk turning off a natural ability. Will admits that his skill has less to do with a personality disorder than an active imagination. This imagination resurfaces again when Will finds himself in a psych ward. In a cell, Will does precisely what the writer would do. He retreats to the depth of his mind to create a world that brings him pleasure. Matthew Brown, the guard watching Will, asks him if he wants a book, and Will replies, "I have my imagination." In his imaginary world, Will is able to indulge his passion for fly fishing, and he's reunited with a daughter figure he acquired, a daughter figure whose death he's charged with. This world within a world could be the writer working on a new project. My first commercially released novel, Famous for Nothing, was written as a break after I authored a highly transgressive novel about man's need to control women. I thought that after I explored a dark corridor of my mind, I could take a detour to sunny LA to recharge my emotions. This was my fly fishing trip. I was placed in a mental prison for my transgressive novel, and because no agent would represent it, I had to get out. They could not, in good conscience, put the novel I had written out into the world. I haven't returned to the manuscript after it was rejected by somewhere between 40 to 60 literary agents. Mostly because I'm afraid to. I can confirm that the reprieve to the sunny territory didn't keep me from writing about taking a life again. 2 novels later, more characters died. This was me wading into the water, still feeling the prison of my previous novel. These tangents are just that. Momentary breaks from the true nature of things. As Fuller's Hannibal progresses, Will finds himself stepping into the shoes of psychopaths, and he becomes increasingly unable to kick these shoes off. Will's journey through the first season is guided by a large, steed-like creature, as well as a Wendigo that the audience is led to believe is Lucifer himself. This chilling image of a man outfitted in total darkness, with a crown of antlers, appears as a looming presence while Will goes deeper into Fuller's world. The worse things get, the more this being appears. By the end of the first season, Will has found himself with a tube down his throat as the carnage that he investigated is fed to him. Will is force-fed an ear, just like that single image I was able to locate in my mind of the Ridley Scott Hannibal film. If Will Graham remains our substitute for the writer, this scene is finally when these reenactments move into real life. Before, Will was dancing a ballet, now he's walking each step not as a design, but instead as a way to escape the very things he chose to stalk before. Will Graham was once dancing a ballet, but now he's taking each step not as a design, but instead as a way to escape the very things he chose to stalk forward to before. Will is placed in a psych ward and condemned by everyone around him. All the people that were so encouraging of his abilities abandon Will, except for Dr. Lecter, the very man who put him in that cell. It's revealed that Dr. Lecter used a technique called psychic driving with Will that involved flashing lights and providing suggestive reinforcement. Will's unique brain activity, mixed with the psychic driving by Lecter, left him unsure if he had committed the acts he was being blamed for. Hannibal mentions, Stravinsky said that a true composer thinks of his unfinished work the whole time. He's not conscious of this, but he's aware of it when he suddenly knows what to do. So why was Will allowed to continue to work despite all of the events that demanded he distance himself from this entire fiasco? We're looking at this as the writer, as Will Graham. The writer is only continuing because of the motivator. In Fuller's Hannibal, Jack Crawford assumes the role of the motivator. Jack, throughout the series, continually pushes Graham to the edge, then occasionally continues pushing him past his limit. He's constantly offering rationalizations to Will, primarily, "You're saving lives." The motivator always shows up when the writer chooses death as a topic. My questions of, what if someone reads this and views it as inspirational? Or, is this doing more evil than good? Are constantly asked in my mind, but the motivator, in his baritone Morpheus voice, assures us, you're helping people. People are responsible for their own actions, and if it wasn't your influence, it would be someone else's. Jack Crawford is no different than the motivator inside my head. Various characters, such as a fleeting love interest for Will and Dr. Bloom, warn Jack that Will is treading in dangerous water, but Jack operates on the code that Will is saving lives, so he should continue. If Will is the writer, arriving with the question, how does all of this fit together, the motivator will whisper, your work will do more good than bad. You have to trust people's ability to tell the difference between fantasy and reality. It's one of the most common techniques I employ when I'm writing a book about things that could possibly happen in real life, but I hope they don't. It's how I allow myself to continue to create monsters. In Fuller's version of the Lecter saga, the created monster appears as Mads Mikkelsen's Hannibal. We've made it this far in our theory about the show Hannibal, without mentioning Hannibal himself in detail. There's a reason for that. If this was Hannibal's show, he would be all over the first half hour of this podcast. Hannibal is merely a part of Will Graham's journey as the writer, so here we are, finally. Good evening, Dr. Lecter. The created monster in Hannibal serves as the confident being that constantly psychically drives the writer by reminding him, I'm the reason why everything is moving forward. He hisses, you can't stop me because you love me. You can't kill me because without me, where does that leave you? In the show, Hannibal could be viewed as the face of evil. Mads, in interviews, describes him as the fallen angel. Abel Gideon, another psychopathic doctor, refers to Hannibal as smoke. This idea of Hannibal being smoke makes him as a force that you cannot stay in the same room with. It is a warning of trouble ahead. There's that old saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. Hannibal may be the smoke that precedes the devil's fire. This series treats Hannibal as something beyond the other humans in the show. They fall victim to his charm. They believe his lies. They eat his cooking. And they like it. Initially, Hannibal seeks a friendship with Will Graham. There's one episode that features a one-off character, a lesser psychopath, who ends up using a bow to play a performance on a man's vocal cords. This is a performance. This act reveals the man with the problem reaching out to another man with a problem. The brutal set piece is only a means for a parallel. Hannibal wants to connect with Will in the same way he wants to play Will. In the pilot episode, Will advises that he doesn't find Hannibal very interesting, and Hannibal responds simply, "You will." Beyond the play on the character name, hinting at their unity, Hannibal sets in motion a situation where Will is forced to find Hannibal interesting, if for no other reason than for his own self-preservation. Hannibal finds Will interesting because Will has a power that Hannibal does not. The created monster looks to the writer and admires the skill that the writer has. Hannibal expresses frustration over this power. He yearns for this power. Hannibal remarks, in one of the more gripping dialogue passages in the series, "Occasionally I drop a teacup to shatter on the floor on purpose. I'm not satisfied when it doesn't gather itself back up again." Then he adds a subtle demand that Will and he work together. Someday, perhaps that cup will come together. Gillian Anderson, who plays Hannibal's therapist, when interrogated, states that what Hannibal does is not coercion, it's persuasion. Hannibal needs Will to put the teacup back together. He won't force Will to do it in some Ray Liotta moment. He'll persuade him instead. So what about the real-life monster in Hannibal? Let's get back to that one later. The character parallels we've identified so far are exclusive to Fuller's version of Hannibal. This is something that Fuller created, consciously or otherwise, that adds previously absent layers to the character of Dr. Lecter. The exploration of the impact of death lit that colors Hannibal in its dark green hues is not present in Thomas Harris's Red Dragon. Yet I have to wonder if Fuller didn't add Harris himself into the mix when creating this own take. Thomas Harris is famous for his Hannibal series, and his remoteness. I have no idea why Harris has stepped so far back from the spotlight, and this is mainly due to his actions creating a glass case that places him isolated like his created monster. I fully accept that this Terrence Malick-like isolation could have more to do with the man than his work, but in reading Red Dragon, after I blew through the Hannibal seasons in 1 month and was desperate for more, I found that there were constant prods from Jack Crawford regarding bringing Will back to this gory job. Harris's 1975 debut novel, Black Sunday, details a terrorist plot that planned to take place at the Super Bowl in New Orleans. It's said that Harris was haunted by the '72 Munich crisis, and this time, the real-life monster inspired the created monster. Harris went on to write Red Dragon in '81, and it stands as the first release in his Hannibal Lecter series. The novel begins with Will Graham living a contented existence in Florida with his ugly dogs and his boat motors. When Jack Crawford arrives and attempts to pull Will back in, shades of the motivator that Fuller employs can be found. The motivator's most common tactic to get the writer to man up is echoed in Jack's trip to the Graham residence. Jack states, regarding Will, "There's nobody better with evidence, and he has this other thing too. Imagination, projection, whatever." Crawford knows that Will has talent, and Will knows that this talent will not lay dormant, even if he tries to force it into latency. It can be slowed down with family life, but it cannot be stopped. Jack takes advantage of this. The motivator brings up the situation. "These people are dead. Can you tell me how this happened?" Once the writer relents and thinks, "Yeah, how did this happen?" the process is already in motion. Eventually, the second guessing comes into play, but the motivator will convince the writer that the questions, and finding out their answers, are worth the hundreds of hours they will demand. When Will expressed an inability to dwell on the dark content in Red Dragon, it sounded like Harris becoming unwilling to focus on the dark after his debut novel about terrorism. The motivator pushes the writer's pen and suddenly the manuscript prods you. You shake it off and keep thinking. It's hard to leave Deathlit because the motivator looms, always. In the last episode of the second season, Hannibal tells Will, "I gave you a rare gift and you didn't want it. You would deny my life." Will quickly corrects, "Not your life." The created monster then acknowledges Will's abandonment of him as a confidant and an outlet, and Hannibal says, "My freedom then, you would take that from me, confine me to a prison cell. Do you believe that you could change me the same way I've changed you?" The writer confirms, "I already did." Those around Will and Hannibal are a means to an end. Elena Bloom recognizes this in Will and Hannibal, and it's echoed in her quote, "People are not instruments. Whatever it is you're playing, you have to listen very carefully to what you're creating." It's not Hannibal's murder that the writer is so tantalized with. It's the idea of murder. In a scene where Will is handed a knife and he has a chance to slice Hannibal's neck, he instead frees his monster. Will only liked the fantasy of the death, but the reality would change too much, and it would leave him all alone. Hannibal knows this, as evidenced by his observation. It's the prospect of death that drives us to greatness. Sealing in his necessity as a character, outlined in the writer's mentality, assuring him that death is necessary and art will come of it. What happens when it steps out of art? Finally, this brings us to the real-life monster. This monster is treated uniquely in Fuller's version of the Hannibal story, and it's one of the keys to understanding the writer's journey when dealing with death. In Jonathan Demme's film adaptation of The Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill, a man desperate to become a woman is kidnapping big fat people and using their skin to construct a woman suit. We only get to see Buffalo Bill take one of his victims. At the time, Bill is wearing a cast, attempting to load furniture into a van. Buffalo Bill is plagiarizing Ted Bundy, a real-life killer who performed this exact act. Ted Tally's The Silence of the Lambs screenplay draws inspiration from real life, while Fuller's teleplays create a fully functional world that asks, what happens when real life draws from what I've made? The way the writer's work can cause death is through people copying the detailed actions laid out within the work. Fiction becomes real through copycats. Bryan Fuller's Hannibal world is filled with copycats. These copycats are loathed by Hannibal because they're either taking credit for the work he's doing, or they're doing poor, artless imitations. The copycats are loathed by Jack Crawford because they distract from the main narrative. The copycats are loathed by Will Graham because they are inauthentic. When Graham steps into their shoes, it's not the same feeling. Will seems to long for a feeling he hates, a feeling he needs, a feeling he's chasing. Will Graham, despite his peaceful diversions, knows, deep inside himself, that he liked rushing into that kitchen in the first episode, then shooting Garrett Jacob Hobbs. When reflecting on this situation after the fact, Will said, "I don't feel sorry for myself. I feel good." Then furrowed his brow. This is the complicated feeling of enjoying something that may bring others pain. Those forehead creases only get deeper. Will cannot forget the feeling. He can only hope to control it. Will is killed only twice in this show, both times due to acts set in motion by Hannibal. After Will commits the act, each time he's faced no repercussions in the real world for his murders. Only inside his head does he feel the consequences. In a similar way, Hannibal's murders, unlike those of the copycats, are always immune to the real-world investigation that comes along with the type of crimes he commits. Hannibal kills a man in self-defense in his office, and there's no follow-up beyond a police report. There aren't officers stationed outside Hannibal's house until the final episode. Dr. Lecter's house isn't formally searched for the entire show until Beverly Katz breaks in. Hannibal's crimes exist in a fictional world, and they aren't pursued, but the copycats are hunted like real-life criminals. The copycats in Fuller's universe are caught after a single murder. Each character in the show has a motivation to eliminate the copycats because they threaten Will Graham's ability to continue on. The writer will go so far as to consider changing the narrative because of these copycats. Everything that was written before will be reviewed again. To re-enter the editing process when the final draft felt locked is the type of activity that will delay completion. The motivator needs the writer to be unburdened for him to flex his true talent. The real-life monster in Hannibal watches what the created monster performed, then they try to replicate it. Due to their admiration, due to their need to wield the power that the created monster carries with their status as an enviable figure. The real-life monsters are still hard at work in our present time. Just this year, another highly exploited real-life story with fiction influences spurred massive headlines. 2 tweens had become obsessed with Victor Surge's created monster, Slender Man, and they tried to copy his acts by stabbing one of their peers in the woods. After this happened, one afternoon, when the phones weren't ringing at work, my coworkers began to discuss the story. "I wonder if the guy who created Slender Man feels any guilt," I remarked casually, not expecting an answer, yet receiving one. "He does, and he should," was a definitive statement by the guy who sits 2 seats away from me. The same guy who torrented Hannibal for me. I mumbled, "But, maybe they would have just found, Pinhead, and done the same thing?" This is about when I started sweating as I looked at my Google Docs account on the computer screen, and it detailed at least 7 novels I had written that deal with a character's life being taken in intricate detail. They found something that spoke to them, and with writing, it's different. "Writing is closer," he said. Bryan Fuller knows this, he displays this, and it's not out of the question to think that Victor Surge is going through something similar to Will Graham's journey. This is a real-life situation where the copycats of the created monster become the real monster. In the Slender Man case, when the media asked, "How did this happen?" it was pretty clear that, at least in part, the created monster was to blame. Bryan Fuller's Hannibal is the only show that dares to address this "how did it happen?" question. The writer doesn't want to address this because it implicates him. The only other discussion of this question I've encountered in fiction is in Bret Easton Ellis's Lunar Park, a mock memoir in which a copycat replicates the crimes of Patrick Bateman. Patrick Bateman is Ellis's fictional character from his novel American Psycho. In Ellis's Lunar Park, it doesn't hint that Patrick Bateman may have influenced the real-life monster. It outright accepts this theory. Then Bret carefully steps through how a writer would deal with this. Answer: not well. Answer: with alcohol. In Fuller's Hannibal, the real-life monster comes in the form of an orderly at the institution Will has been sent to. This orderly, named Matthew Brown, proceeds to kill a bailiff in Graham's court case, basing his kill off the case files of the Hobbs case. This orderly has a normal, boring name and a normal, boring job, and he sees the created monster, then finds inspiration. Yes, even Fuller's naming of the character indicates a real-life monster. The Margot Verger, Alana Bloom, Hannibal Lecter naming convention is broken by the dull commonality of Matthew Brown. You don't know a Mason Verger. You don't know an Abigail Hobbs. You probably know a Matthew Brown. You might even be Matthew Brown. After the real-life monster commits his act, Will, terrified by the influence he caused, sends the real-life monster to destroy the created monster. It could seem like bizarre logic at first, but what the writer is trying to do is stop the influence altogether. Fuller has the real-life monster find the created monster, and because Matthew Brown only follows a blueprint set out by Hannibal, the situation becomes familiar. The copycat puts Hannibal in a very Hannibal-like situation, but because the real-life monster does not have the pillow of fiction easing his landing, the motivator arrives and he eliminates the real-life monster easily. This resolution happens, buffered by the commercial breaks. In Fuller's world, the real-life monster can be tracked. The real-life monster can be found. The real-life monster can be eliminated, but his impact cannot. The created monster, freed by the motivator, continues with his dramatic flourishes to the point that he releases the writer from prison. Once free, the writer begins to realize the created monster was psychically driving him, and he sets out to repair things. Alana Bloom, a bystander to most of this, accurately summarizes where Hannibal and Will find themselves when she mentions, "Freddie Lowndes thinks you two are a paradox. She sees something no one else sees." Will responds, "What's that?" And Elena says, "That neither of you is the killer she's writing about. But together, you might be." Freddie Lowndes, a tabloid journalist who runs a site called Tattle Crime, can be viewed as the writer's perspective on a clickbaiting journalist. Will's resentment toward Freddie, the true crime author, was instant and constant throughout both seasons. When he eventually does have to call on Freddie, he willingly provides her with the exclusive rights to his story. If Will is the writer, you'd think he'd do anything to retain his book rights. But Will's story is true crime, and the fiction writer does not concern himself with the non-fiction details. Will wants to continue the story where the limitations of the real world do not bog down the narrative. He eventually gets to kill Freddie Lowndes, but it's only fiction. Freddie is still alive in the Hannibal universe. This is the murder that the writer is interested in. When Will finds a man who is turning victims into angels by slicing the skin on their back, then suspending it to look like wings, there are no true crime elements to the case. Will easily locates the angel man, and the climactic scene takes place in a barn where the killer is tied to the rafters with a rope. The question that anyone would have walking into this barn is, who tied him up there? But that's not the question for Will. The act becomes important, not the gritty, real-world details. Bryan Fuller's appearance on Scott Thompson's post-mortem interview series explains that he's not concerned with the true-life detail of these crimes, but instead he's interested in why people are performing these acts and how it affects everyone around them. This disinterest to the reality of the act is very telling. Fuller has become focused on the effect that portraying these stories has on people. He sees us as those kids, those onlookers gawking at the blood spots. When Will finds that Freddie Lowndes posted a picture that an officer took at the crime scene of a murder on Tattle Crime, he deems the act tasteless. Hannibal asks Will, "Do you have trouble with taste?" And the writer admits, "My thoughts are often not tasty." The created monster says, "Nor are mine. No effective barriers." To this, Will responds simply, "I build forts." These forts can work for a while, but the real-life monster can easily break through them. For the real-life monster, animal mutilation is a common warning sign of possible further proclivities. Will sees himself in his mind as a massive raven stag, and he's a cat lady when it comes to dogs. And this tells us that he does not have the same instincts that a normal, real-life psychopath would. Hannibal, however, is shown as a cook. Every episode chronicles the joy that Hannibal experiences while in his kitchen. His recipes are artfully scrawled on aged index cards. They are detailed and careful. His ingredients, sometimes animal, sometimes not, are prepared with normal recipes with minor and major substitutions. This ambiguity in the chef's ingredients even leads Jack Crawford to get a lidded dish to go from Hannibal's dinner party. The created monster was expecting this, and he prepared accordingly. The created monster and the motivator have a relationship where they need each other, and if one turns on the other, then both their existences are in jeopardy. By showing up to a planned event, then taking a food sample, the motivator set up a situation that would clear the created monster, so the writer's journey could continue. The topic of monsters versus animals plays out numerous times in the series. There's Will Graham's visions, and there's also a previous patient of Hannibal's who wants to become a cave bear. This animal versus monster situation comes to a head in an episode where a man, kicked by a horse, is taken advantage of by a created monster. This monster, like Hannibal, presents a professional and trustworthy exterior, but inside, the beast rages. The man kicked by the horse, despite having a mental disability from the jarring interaction, maintains a deep connection with animals. The walls of his room are lined with their cages. Will Graham sees himself in this man, and when the episode peaks, Will sees the man's mentor as Hannibal. The man who was kicked in the head by the horse is revealed to be sewing the psychopath's victims into animals so they could have a rebirth. This is how Fuller shows the writer's torment regarding being painted as a madman when he was just searching to create new life, to assist in rebirth. At the climax of the episode, the created monster stops the writer from going over the edge. Hannibal physically blocks the motion of the hammer on Will's gun, and this act is not to save Will, but instead to send the message that the created monster handles these dramatic actions, not the writer. In the final episode of the second season of Hannibal, Fuller, in a way, completes a conversation he began with the pilot. I'm sure that the poor ratings, the graveyard Friday night time slot, and the talented actors looking at other possibilities all factored into the closing of the narrative, but it was closed with such a flourish it created one of the most exciting nights of television in 2014. The writer, Will Graham, maintains an allegiance with both the motivator and the created monster until the end. Then no one escapes the repercussions of a plan that began 2 years ago. The woman the writer once loved, the girl he imagined in his dreams, the man who motivated him, and the created monster who saw his potential, all converge on the main setting of the show, Hannibal's home, in the final episode. In the end, the created monster claims all. Will, Abigail, and Jack end up sliced at the hand of Hannibal, and we leave them on the floor of Hannibal's home, pools of their blood slowly expanding, unifying. We know the writer survives because we've paged through Red Dragon, where, in the opening chapter, the injury Will sustains in the show is mentioned. Hannibal, the created monster, disappears into thin air, seemingly untouchable, like smoke. You'll start asking, didn't anyone check his passport before he got on his intercontinental flight? Didn't that FBI lady from Sex and the City who took over for Jack put out a warrant for Hannibal's arrest? Yes, this is all true if Hannibal was bound by the real-life monster rules. But Hannibal is the created monster. He is smoke. And after the dust up inside Hannibal's house, the smoke rose into the air. Intangible. Looking back, the most important interaction of Fuller's 2-season-long Hannibal arc comes between Will and Hannibal as they discuss the murder of Beverly Katz, one of the members of the behavioral science team Will was placed on. Hannibal tells Will that Beverly died at his own behest, and the scene plays out further. Will says, "Oh, I am no more guilty of what you've accused me of than you are of what I've accused you of." Hannibal states, "I don't expect you to feel self-loathing, regret, or shame. You knew what you were doing, and you made your own decisions. Decisions that were under your control." Will asks, "Oh, you think I'm in control?" And Hannibal responds, "You found a way to hurt me. I wonder how many people are going to get hurt by what you do." This was Fuller's review of the writer's selfish, dangerous need to play Reaper, and I cannot wait for Hannibal's third season, because, as a writer, I need to know if the story is over, or how it continues on. I discovered Bryan Fuller's Hannibal through my own work, and now it has me terrified of my own work. Imagine creating as a release of pain, then indirectly causing more pain. Imagine the chain reaction this could create. I have to imagine that what I put into the world doesn't affect others because I cannot stop putting it into the world. The next time a real-life monster commits an act that has traceable roots in the writer's influence, it's unclear who will be blamed. But the fact remains that the created monster will live on because, once he's born, he cannot be destroyed. The moment you give life to something that takes life, you become an accomplice and you have to live with that. Unless, of course, the monsters you've created find you first. That was my essay on Bryan Fuller's Hannibal. That was another piece that Vice rejected, and I thought I'd put in the podcast here, continue on the legacy. I haven't recently submitted anything to Vice, so there'll be a bit of a hiatus on this, but if you liked this podcast and you haven't caught the other rejections, you can check out the Shia LaBeouf rejection and the Post-Empire Canyons rejection. I'll put both links to those there, or you can find them on tjamesreagan.com. You can buy my books on Amazon. My novels are Famous for Nothing. It's a celebrity satire. Empire Waste, which I reference in this piece, it's about the New York City fashion industry. It's also a lot about the creative process, about pain. If you related to any of this as a writer, pretty much what I did was I took myself as a writer and I placed myself in the fashion world, because novelists writing novels about novelists should be illegal. It's like on the level of a think piece. It's terrible. But if it's a fashion guy, then suddenly it's amazing. It's amazing. Empire Waste is an amazing novel, is what I'm trying to tell you. And then my final novel, not my final, and the podcast just ends with me like, my most recent novel. Oh, God. This is a terrible way to end a podcast about violence, where it sounds like I'm signing off for good. I assure you, I'm still alive. You can go on my Twitter feed, at @TJamesReagan. I will be posting something about Britney Spears or Liv Tyler within a half hour. You can confirm I'm still alive. This isn't one of those like sign-offs where you never see me again. Even if you want it to be, I'm still going to be around. I don't know, unless something does it. Unless some real-life monster does claim me, then this will be my last thing. You can put it on my gravestone, all 5,000 words of this. It'll just be one, it'll be like a scroll where you can open up the scroll and read it, but still no one will read it anyways. Or, I don't know. Once you die, you get at least some readers. Some people will be like, oh, I really loved his work. There's like something finite about it where he's like, oh, he's not going to release Empire Waste 2 even more wasted or something like that, where it makes it harder to screw up your legacy. But I think I'm doing a pretty good job of screwing up my legacy by just having this podcast. So if you enjoy what I'm doing here, you probably need a therapist. But in the meantime, go buy my books, Famous for Nothing, Empire Waste, and Leeds House is the newest one. It's a cabin in the woods, horror comedy, has a lot to do with Catholicism, homosexuality, and those bad VHS horror movies that you rented. Oh, and metalcore music. It's not selling well. That's a shocker. No one's like, but, metalcore books are essentially the new zombie novel. Everyone's buying them. Everyone's like, oh, I don't want to read The Devil Wears Prada, the book. I want to read a book about the band Devil Wears Prada. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know. I'm just going to end this. I'm sorry. Now you know why Vice rejects all my shit, because I am literally a lunatic. But I'm not a lunatic in the bad way. This isn't something where I'm like, oh, I'm a crazy person and I'm writing these things about, my own craziness. I mean, I am writing them about my craziness, but it's like neuroses crazy, not hurt people crazy. Oh, and check out Bryan Fuller's Hannibal. It's a great show. It's a great show. They keep postponing season 3. I have no idea if season 3 will fit in my little theory here. I'll probably just bend it over backwards and make it fit. So maybe I'll do a part 2 of this thing. Because I just said that I'd never do a part 2 of anything. So keep a lookout for that. I'm going to write something else for Vice, and they're going to tell me I suck or just ignore me like text messages to pretty girls. Okay. This has been the T. James Reagan podcast.